Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's InfraSight webinar on the UK Railways Bill and Rail Reform. My name is Steve Allen. I'm a Vice President in the UK and Europe division at CPCS. Just before we start, a few housekeeping items. If you have any comments or particularly questions you'd like to raise, then put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can in the discussion. To keep us on time, everybody except the panelists will be muted, and we will send out a recording of the webinar shortly after it finishes, so don't worry if you miss anything. If you have any follow-up questions, please email them to communications@cpcs.ca. So today we're joined by a very distinguished panel. We have Vernon Everett, who is the Transport Commissioner for Greater Manchester and also Chair of Transport for Wales, Maggie Simpson, who is the Director General of the Rail Freight Group, and Stephen Glaister, who is Emeritus Professor of Transport and Infrastructure at Imperial College London and also a former Chair of the Office for Road and Rail. Just before we start, I'd like to make clear that panelists' comments are, of course, their own and do not represent the views of CPCS or indeed any of our clients. So to get us off, I'm going to ask a question of each of the panelists. So clearly the nature of legislation is that arrangements are set out at a very high level and a lot gets filled in later in subsidiary documentation and the bill itself may be subject to change as it goes through passage in Parliament. But with that as background, I'd like to ask each of the panelists, what do you see as the main positive aspects of the legislation, firstly, and that you'd like to see those preserved as the bill progresses? Are there any things that you think need to be changed through the process? And are there any gaps or omissions that you see in the current plans? Perhaps we start that with Stephen.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. Well, what is good in the current bill before Parliament and should be preserved? I'm very pleased to see the preservation of what we know now as the high-level output specification and statement of funds available system, where the government says what it wants and what it's willing to pay for. That survives in a slightly weakened form, but it's good in the British system. It's rather unusual to have that level of long-term planning in public expenditure. It is not in the bill statutory in the way that it is in the current arrangements, which is a slight disadvantage. It's good to see a licence condition on the long-term asset stewardship for Great British Railways. That's been missing in the past, and of course it's sensible to have it. What's not clear to me is how that is going to be enforced. It is to be enforced by the ORR, that's clear, but what powers enforcement the ORR actually has with teeth is unclear to me, and that perhaps should be clarified. And it's very good that there's going to be a long-term strategic plan for the railway. Again, as I read it, it seems to be the job of the Department for Transport to write that plan. Presumably in consultation with Great British Railways, but whoever does it, it's a good thing to have, and we haven't really had that in the past, and absolutely essential with the railway, given the life of the asset. So those are all good things. In terms of what is a worry in the current bill, there are two big things for me. One is that it's going to create an enormous monopoly, and a very powerful one, subject to direction by the Secretary of State. That direction is mandatory and binding. It seems to me that if that survives, it will inevitably make Great British Railways essentially a sub-department of the Department for Transport. The government will be running the railway. Whatever we'd like to think, that will be where it comes back to, because everything will drop back to the Secretary of State. Do we really want that? Does Parliament want that? I'm not so sure. I think it's a very powerful thing to happen, and we've never had it before in the history of the British Railways. Governments, generally speaking, are not thought to be good at running railways. The other important change in the legislation is, of course, the arrangements for deciding who has access to the railway and on what terms. And for me, the crucial thing about the way that's going to work is what powers and duties the system operator has within Great British Railways. It would have been, in my view, better to have had an independent body as a system operator. That's not what's proposed, and I don't think it was ever going to happen. So it's part of Great British Railways. So we need to be clear by what criteria the system operator is going to allow access to the system. Currently, as I read it, there's a primary duty to give access to Great British Railways' own passenger services as specified by the Secretary of State. That kind of puts access by all the other operators, freight, mayoral services, the devolved authorities, on a second footing, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to work out. The system operator will have a very difficult job to interpret phrases like best overall value, fair, public interest, which I've read in the bill and the supporting documents. And perhaps we need to worry about how we give real meaning to that. And Network Rail have published, or rather Great British Railways have published a discussion document very recently about all that, which is worth a read. It's not a bad document at all. It does show you how hard it's going to be for the system operator to resolve all those conflicts. I wonder whether ORR, the Office of Rail and Roads, independent appeal powers are adequate. People are saying the ORR will have an appeals function, which it will, but it seems that that's going to be only on the lines of a judicial review, not on the substance. It will only be about whether process has been followed and whether it's been within the law, not about whether the substance of the decision has been made sensibly. And that's important, and I think may require some thought. I think we need more clarity on what the rights of the mayoral authorities really are, London, Manchester, Birmingham and those other places. They seem to be consultees, rather, but what else, what other powers will they have to get what they need? And I'm sure Vernon will say more on that. And to finish on that section, I think the net result of what's proposed will be inevitably the death of an open access services. The Department of Transport has always been unhappy with open access. They will now have the absolute power to prevent it, and I think in practice that will be the case. I'm not talking about freight, but open access passenger services. Again, that's policy. Maybe that's what the government wants, but I think it should be. In my view, it'll be a shame because I think open access has done some good things and could do more. I think it's something that needs thinking about. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Stephen. That's really helpful and a good introduction. Maybe turn to Maggie next, and really the same question, but from the particular perspective of freight.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Stephen, for a good opening summary as well. Look, I think as we can see in Great British Railways, it's a manifesto commitment. Nationalising the passenger railways is incredibly popular as a policy. That's going to go ahead, and it's going to create that large monopoly business that Stephen spoke about. And it's not my job to comment on the passenger railway, but of course what it means is that the infrastructure manager, who today Network Rail is independent of who runs on it, in future won't be. It'll be in the same camp as 75% of the trains, and of course that's a nervousness for the people who are in the 25% who aren't part of GBR. Now we've been really clear on that, right from the inception of the thinking of the Williams Review, and measures that we like in the bill are some of the things that help to try and counter that. So the statutory duty, the 6 statutory duties, growing freight is one of them. A requirement on the Secretary of State to publish a target to increase the amount of goods moved by rail, another powerful hook in there, which in that cultural space when people at GBR decide what they're going to prioritise, their attention, spending, and so on, to have those hooks in there that you can point to. They're really powerful, and we like the fact that they're in there. The bits that we like less, I think, are some of the points that Stephen's alluded to around the changes to the access framework. If I look at the people who are, have vested interests in freight, who are interested in growing rail freight, obviously it's the freight train operators, but most importantly, it's the businesses who use rail freight to underpin their supply chains, whether they're moving goods into supermarkets or into ready-mix plants to support construction of new homes or whatever. They need to know that they can rely on the railways. And when they move across to using rail, that's a big investment for them. It might be a physical investment in a new terminal or some wagons or some other systems, but equally it's a big commitment in terms of just redesigning their supply chains, not having the lorries that they used to have. And they need to know that if it's going to do that it's there for the long term. So a capacity allocation system which hangs around something called an infrastructure capacity plan, where GBR can, whenever it reviews one of those, start with a blank sheet of paper, in effect, is making people really nervous. Because today, generally speaking, you'll have an access right, but at the end of the access right, generally speaking, if the train's still running, then you'll get that rolled into the next contract. That's pretty much a given, and that isn't the case under these new plans. And we add into that the clause which allows GBR to put its own trains on the network first, and it all becomes very curious. And we're spending a lot of time talking to people about what their UP will say in those subsequent documents, but there's still some way to go for real clarity on how that will all hang together. Stephen talks about the system operator, but we're not even clear that it will be done centrally or whether it'll be done in the business units or the regions or whatever they're going to be called in future. Who actually is doing this is still unclear, for example. And that brings us on to the appeals role, which, I think, Stephen, you were being rather kind about in saying that it was a bit vague. I think it's fairly clear that it's useless, as currently described, that one's ability to actually raise an effective appeal to meet the threshold that the bill sets out, bearing in mind the bill also enables the Secretary of State to set further requirements and fees and such like, is going to be an incredibly high bar. And even if you can make it, the actions that the ORR can take are frankly pretty limited in all other than the most obscure of cases. So we really think that is a worry, that not only have you got a very, very changed system against the backdrop of an infrastructure manager who's no longer independent, but your right to appeal is pretty watered down. And actually, I compare that to the new powerful passenger watchdog which the bill creates. And it seems that, passengers are going to get much more support if GBR does something that goes against their interests, whereas, other operators, freight in particular, gets a lot less than it gets today. And that's a real concern for us.
Great, thank you. And now, Vernon, looking from the point of view of the combined authorities and devolved governments.
Yes, thank you, Steve. And I'll echo, I suspect, some of what Stephen and Maggie said. But I guess as a starting point from a devolved, so I work in Greater Manchester. I work for Andy Burnham, the mayor there. I also work to the Cabinet Secretary in Wales as far as the Welsh railways are concerned. And I guess the major thing that is to be welcomed is the construction of a single guiding mind, because for the first time it puts together all of the fragmented bits of the railway and enables us to have one set of conversations. And there is recognition in the bill of mayoral combined authorities and the fully devolved administrations. The thing, I guess, that we are concerned about is culturally, how does that all work? What the likes of Greater Manchester and the West Midlands and any other actually combined strategic authority you can name outside of London and the South East really want the railway to help deliver improvements to their local economies, to local productivity, to the creation of homes, jobs, getting people to places of education, health outcomes, and opportunity more generally. And actually, everyone views it as a way of tackling inequality. Good transport tackles inequality. And therefore, having a strong local voice is really, really important, because otherwise what you tend to hear a lot of is talk about the railway almost as if the railway is a thing in itself. And I think the thing that we really want to overcome as we develop the relationship with Great British Railways is to ensure that that isn't the case, that we respect the national connectivity which the railway needs to produce, but also those running the railways really understand those local needs. So I guess what we would like to see strengthened in the bill is a clearer statutory role for mayors. It's very high level at the moment, and it's sort of all embedded really, or left to policy and guidance rather than be in the face of the bill. So that's a concern. I think we would like to see more overt recognition of the place of local transport plans. Everywhere, including London, has to produce its own local transport plan. And therefore, the railway outputs need to be in the context of that local transport plan, again, while recognising the national role, the national connectivity that the railway is there to deliver. And I think we would like to see a more structured right to request set of clauses. There is an opportunity for local mayors to request devolution. And of course, that already exists in Merseyrail. That's a fully devolved railway to the Liverpool City region. We've got one in Wales, the Core Valley Lines, track and train, already together with services. And I think we're proving through all of that local areas can deliver really good railways. So we would like a clearer path to the right to request, because again, that it's a bit vague about how you get there and what criteria might be offered up. So we're actually experiencing, if I take Greater Manchester as an example, the weekend before last was the biggest fares revision ever, certainly for decades in Greater Manchester, where there was fare simplification agreed with us to lay the path for fully integrated fares and ticketing between Greater Manchester's buses, trams and trains. And therefore the national fare structure has been changed very radically. And actually more than half of the people in Greater Manchester end up paying cheaper fares as a result. And you don't have to wait for the right train to turn up with the right logo on it before you get on it to take you to, for example, Manchester Airport. So there are already good signs that this can produce better outcomes for passengers and for local economies. But in the areas that I think Stephen, May and I have highlighted, we would like more detail and strengthening in the face of the bill. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks. I was interested in following up on what you're saying there. Because Manchester's recently published a very ambitious strategy for rail in the region.
Yeah.
How do you see these new arrangements helping you implement that strategy, or is there more detail to be filled out on how that will work?
The early signs are good. What we decided to do in Manchester is not wait for this legislation before starting to integrate the core, if you like, commuter routes into and out of Greater Manchester. So, in London, people familiar with London will know London Overground, which is a locally controlled network, and we have a similar one in Greater Manchester, and we've anticipated the introduction of the bill by agreement with Great British Railways, so that eight lines will be branded the B network. So the B network is Greater Manchester's integrated system, bringing everything together, including active travel. So in the near term, whilst those services will still be run by Northern Trains, which is in public ownership now, they will be branded in the same way and fall within an integrated fares and customer information strategy, so that from a customer point of view, you don't care whose logo's on the side. And we're also putting some local money into strengthened services, strengthened safety, particularly the safety of women and girls, and really applying all the things that we've applied to the local bus and tram networks to make them successful. So I think we're starting to feel the benefits of that new relationship, and we'll see how that goes. That we haven't even touched on, and it probably, Steve, isn't the place for this place isn't for the conversation of it, but there is a whole separate set of discussions need to be had on long-term infrastructure investment, because everywhere outside London has been starved of it, and it's very, very serious. The West Coast main line is creaking. It's at capacity. We've had the cancellation of HS2 up to Greater Manchester and up to Leeds, and there hasn't been much out recently about east-west connectivity in the north. So if we're gonna make the north work, and I'll be quiet in a second, the one last point I would make is, if you put together the economies of North Wales, Liverpool City region, Manchester City region, all of whom have a devolved government or an elected mayor, you put that together with the new mayoralty that will be created in Warrington and Cheshire in 2027, and you have somewhere a footprint of an area that's 2/3 the size of London, with a huge number of, British Aerospace are there, lots of high-tech companies are there. And I think that is the next set of discussions about how we're going to invest in the infrastructure to connect up those places so that they can fulfill their economic potential and narrow that yawning productivity gap that there still is between London and the southeast and the rest of the country.
Thank you. I think Stephen wants to come in on this.
Yes, I mean, we all know that the track capacity in the neighbourhood of the big cities, London, Manchester and so on, is really very constrained. For many, many years there's been a lot of competition between long distance services, locally sponsored services and freight. And Vernon, you and I both worked in London, where that was a big conflict between the mayor and the Secretary of State. A lot of progress has been made, and you're proposing a lot more in line with the wish to devolve powers. Do you think, under the new legislation as drafted in the bill, it will be easier or harder for you to achieve what you need than it's been in the past with the achievements that have been made? It looks harder to me, but I'm not expert.
Would you like me to answer that, Steve? Is that okay?
Yes.
I think it will be easier. We will, not least for the one reason that we would have one set of discussions with people that can actually then make things happen. Because at the moment, the cat herding that you have to do across the railways industry, because of the way in which it's structured, it's not individuals seeking to be difficult. It's because there's just structurally, it's extremely difficult. Network Rail is broken up into different bits. The department is broken up into different bits. So the timetable is written separately from anything else. As Maggie knows, trying to get some decent arrangements in place for freight, that has to be brought within that conversation as well. So I think, provided we can all stay focused on what the outcomes are that we're seeking to deliver through all of this, because otherwise it can become a very technical set. And of course, you need to get into the technicalities of how this is all going to work. But I think the start point is all being agreed on what the outcomes are that the railway should be delivering, particularly in the context of all the work happening across the country, actually, on integrating local transport networks. But I think it will end up being easier. I'm not convinced, however, that the right powers are written into the bill to make it as easy as it should be.
I think fragmentation is really interesting, isn't it? Because it's a word that gets used a lot in the railways, and there are some angles where GBR will deconflict that, as Vernon said, by bringing track and train into those areas in a collected way. But actually, if we're wanting to take a freight train maybe from the port at London Gateway through to Manchester or Scotland, we're running then through, I'm told GBR will have 13, 14, 15 business units. We'll run through a lot of those. we overlay on top the different mayoral authority areas that we'll be running through, particularly in the future as more of those are rolled out. And so it's unclear to me how many timetable conversations do we have to be able to run one train, right? Because actually, if those business units are responsible for the capacity allocation in their areas, then we have to talk to all of them, and we have to make sure that the outcome of each of those discussions are aligned, because we don't have the ability to park up in a lay-by at the boundary, so to speak, as we might be able to do on the road. So actually, it risks being really complex. Now that isn't probably a bill matter. That's an access and use policy matter about how those infrastructure capacity plans are created. But we do think that there needs to be some simplified route for those trains that cross over multiple plan areas to make sure that alignment's there, because it isn't only about having a train path that you can use. It's about making sure that train path is really productive. So if we can get our wagons out and back a sensible time within 24 hours, then we'll be able to increase the amount of goods moved by rail. And if we can't, then obviously it becomes more expensive, and we can't. So there's a lot of there's some fragmentation gets saved. There's some fragmentation that gets created, and until we understand how that all hangs together, I don't think I can answer the question about whether it's easier or more difficult.
I had a similar question, or at least you might be in a similar position about how to answer it, is about promoting private investment. Do you see and start with you, Maggie, but do you see the bill and its arrangements improving or worsening the prospects for private investment in the railways?
So when I think about the private investment in the railways, I'm not particularly thinking about will we ever get a private company to do electrification or build a track. I mean, that's a different question. But in my sector, that's about building new terminals, rolling stock, and so on. And ultimately, you're not going to make that commitment unless you've got a reasonable belief that you can use it. And if the bill doesn't give you that clear sight of access, and it doesn't give you that independent right of appeal, then it's harder to make the case for that investment than it is today. And we're in a globally competitive market for the kind of investment that's being made. The businesses who are buying wagons or building terminals, they're international investors. They can put their money anywhere in the world, and the UK has to take measures to be competitive. And at the moment, the kind of answer you get is, well, we love freight, don't we? So we won't hurt you. And it's like, well, even if you believe that and it's good enough, and I do think that this administration has been good for freight and the team in Network Rail too. But actually, this bill's going to be there for 30 years, and we need that investment to be made for 30 years. So it's going to need more than warm words.
Stephen.
I think on the whole, it's going to make it harder to attract private investment. I mean, if you think about the philosophy of the current system going back to the 93 Act, it was all about, amongst other things, the regulator having a duty to allow an investor to get a fair return if they behaved in an economic and efficient manner. And the independent regulator had the legal powers to ensure that through the charges. That is no longer going to be the case. And as in my view of it, an investor would be investing in essentially a government department, as distinct from a part of a for-profit industry. That's just the nature of what is now being proposed. There will still be all the opportunities to take contracts with Great British Railways. I mean, PFI, PPP things, where a legally binding contract is set to supply services. And I guess there will be the same opportunities to invest in the rolling stock companies. That I suppose will stay as it was. But fundamentally, this is going to be a government department, and it's really hard to carve out a commercial arrangement, commercial investment of the broad sense within a government department. So I think it'll be harder.
Yeah, thank you. Vernon.
So just to say, on rolling stock, Northern Trains, which is the biggest operator across the Northern Mayoral Combined Authorities, is just out for the biggest rolling stock order it has ever placed. And there is also a TransPennine Express are out there at the moment as well for new stock. So in terms of rolling stock, I think there is a sense of renewal going on in a number of areas of the country to follow what's already been done. I think there are two other areas where private money can really play a big difference. The first is on a redevelopment around stations and surrounding land. There are all of the mayoral combined authorities have massive house building targets, and that's going to require new thinking and more agile thinking in terms of parcelling up land, including land currently owned by the public sector, incidentally, including Network Rail, to enable redevelopments and to attract investors in who are prepared to fund and finance these developments. And if I think about what might happen in Greater Manchester, everywhere south of Greater Manchester is largely brownfield, and there is massive development opportunity in that area, commercial and residential. And if we can combine that with investment in the railway infrastructure itself, so for example, there is talk about having a highly frequent Liverpool-Manchester railway as part of the creation of the Northern Powerhouse Rail network, which would connect up Holyhead right the way through to Hull. And we need to work out how that gets funded and financed. And that's not just going to be able to rely on government money, not least because of all of the money that's needing to go into paying for HS2. So I think the other area where there is huge potential for private money to come in is to work with the public sector on new funding models for the way in which that big infrastructure can be delivered, and what can also be delivered through commercial and retail development in and around those stations. So I see great opportunities for rolling stock investment depots, all of that alongside those developments, alongside what the private sector is very good at, and that's developing digital systems, data and customer technology, which helps deliver a more seamless experience for passengers.
Vernon, I can see why the Treasury may, as it has in the past, put pressure on Great British Railways to release surplus land and to cooperate with private developers around stations and all of that. But is there any provision in the bill to require Great British Railways to cooperate in that way?
No. And this is another area where it's left to local arrangements, where the bill itself does not prescribe that at all. But what I can say is those people that are on the call that might know Oxford Road in Greater Manchester, it's a station that's in serious need of investment and development, both to change its platforms so that we can run better services in the city, and also to be developed more widely for residential purposes. And we have found that we've signed a heads of terms for the redevelopment of that station and the other major Manchester stations, and progress is being made. However, and I think it's a bit of a theme for this call really, none of that is enshrined in the bill. It's all left to local agreement, local arrangements, and goodwill, and it comes back to people and relationships probably more than perhaps we would like.
The conversation that we're having is about the licence, actually, because although we completely get the point about using railway land for house building, and my members love house building because it consumes cement, which we can bring in the ingredients for, but the conversation we're having is about how do we protect those key freight sites from redevelopment, because if you don't have a rail linked aggregate site, you've got a road link one, right? And people don't want HGVs in city centres, and we can help to reduce that. So what we're really keen is that where we've got those sites which are essential for the operation of the rail freight network, that they're properly protected, and that GBR can't just sell them from under our tenants' feet without the appropriate consultation. The other part of that is that we have members who want to invest in those sites, but they're constantly under threat from adjacent development, not so much from land take actually, but from bluntly poorly built units leading to lots of noise complaints, dust complaints, operational constraints. And so what we'd really like to see is, Platform 4, GBR's property arm gets going, is that sort of maybe that code of practice to make sure that the new properly, that they've got adequate noise insulation so that our terminals aren't disturbing the tenants overnight, that they can be designed appropriately. So, for example, you put the bedrooms on the far side and the communal areas on the railway side, or whatever, so that we can get that best of both worlds out. Now, they're not for the bill, they're for the subsequent documentation, but protecting those land sites so that people can invest where they're the right ones, and making sure that development isn't building up future problems for the railway are the things that we're having the conversations on.
It's perhaps worth, in the context of this conversation, worth thinking about the very, very high level governance of Great British Railways. What are the incentives on the board? Assuming it's a PLC, I guess that means it has to stay solvent, and that's about it. It has to have an annual report and demonstrate it's a going concern. My point is, the question is, does the board have an incentive to develop land, and I'm not talking about the freight sites, but other kinds of land around it, to get more revenue in order to build a better railway? Or are they going to be more inclined than they used to be, just to go back to the Department for Transport and say, we need more grant to do that? I think that's a general issue. The governance of Great British Railways is a little bit unclear to me. I mean, it's clear, formally speaking, what it is, but if I sit as a board member, what are the incentives on me to engage, for example, in a house building scheme near a station? Or is it just going to cause me more trouble than it's worth? And will I sit on my hands and say, if I need more capital investment, I'll just go to Treasury in the hope?
And it's quite difficult to design those incentives within a publicly owned business in the way that GBR is. Any thoughts on how you might do that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the history says that, haven't they? I mean, going right the way back to the old British Railways Board, they struggled with this issue. Even then, they set up a property board that did develop some land commercially, and London Regional Transport in its day did the same thing. But commentators have said they didn't do it as aggressively as they might have done, and there's lots of complaint. There's lots still, after all these years, still railway land which is not fully used. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, but that is the criticism that's been made, and the question for the bill progress through Parliament is about whether there should be something in there to encourage the right attitude towards developing in the way that Vernon has outlined.
I think, Steve, there's a wider question about the sort of holding to account of GBR and its relationship with the DfT. I think, when you read the bill, you can see powers and levers flying in all different directions through the bill around, the Secretary of State wanting the ability to be able to control GBR whilst also giving GBR operational freedom, backstop provisions, the ability to change things by regulation, littered, all the way through that bill. And it's quite, I think it's, and I've read this bill more than once, as you can imagine. I find it quite hard to come away from it with a very clear sense of that operational freedom and those levers and those controls. And it gets even more complicated, I think, when you look at, particularly from our point in freight, the interplay between the levers that the Scottish ministers rightly have under their devolved powers that the Secretary of State will have, and how GBR will work as well. And I think one of the things I expect to see in that parliamentary scrutiny is some attention to how that holding to account is done. Because I think if you strip it back really, and colleagues mentioned the one licence condition that we know something about, but overall we're expecting the licence and the role of the regulator to be very thinned out. we'd expect an arm's length body of government to be held to account by the NAO and the PAC, but that's very public sector holding to account. So if a future GBR decides to put a lot of freight speed restrictions on, or to cut back spending on stations or whatever, who holds them to account for that? What are the levers that people might reasonably have to raise that and to get that amended? It's not at all clear to me.
Yeah.
Bernard.
So just I guess it builds on what Maggie and Stephen just opened up on the governance. We had an example of this recently, or colleagues on the call might not know that for station accessibility schemes, wherever you are in the country, you have to bid in centrally to the Department for Transport on getting lifts put in and other, any other investment that needs to be made to make it genuinely accessible from street to train for people that are wheelchair users or have other disabilities. And we asked recently whether that could be devolved, and the answer was no. So there is something of a concern about being told from Westminster which of your local Greater Manchester stations should be made step-free and in what order. And that is one good example, I think, of where there isn't enough bite currently in these arrangements. I think, and connected with that, I guess, it is also not clear how the funding and financial transparency works of GBR. How does the money flow? How do you know locally that you're getting a fair amount of enhancements money or maintenance money relative to other parts of the country and all of that? So that is opaque. So I think we would like to see more flesh on the bones around that, around stations, land and regeneration, how it integrates with wider local transport and planning, and because at the moment it's all pitched at a very, very high level.
And the other player, of course, in this is the Treasury. We know that it being more or less a government department or arm's length body, it will be formally subject to the public expenditure control system, notwithstanding the HLOS and SOFA process. I'm not quite sure how they fit together. But historically, the Treasury has always tended to get deeply involved in the detail of the funding. It was the Treasury who insisted on Network Rail selling off lots of arches to fund a particular short-term funding problem that they had. And again, I don't know whether that's capable of being changed or desirable to change it. Maybe it's just the way of life in the British system, but it is going to be a problem in the future, as it has in the past, I suspect. Intervention, micromanaging from the Treasury, as well as micromanaging from the Secretary of State for Transport.
And it's interesting that from the point of view of funding, at least at the outset, the funding streams are going to remain separate. So it's going to be, as you described, a sort of an analogy of the periodic review process for operations, maintenance and renewals of the infrastructure. Operating subsidy comes through separately and is set in the spending reviews, and enhancements similarly. So you've still got separate funding streams for ops, for the infrastructure, and for the enhancements to the infrastructure. Do you think that risks undermining the objective of integration?
It feels to me that unless somebody thought of a clever way of getting the funding of operational passenger services onto a 5-year deal, then it might be a better compromise than having everything on a 1-year deal. Because I think we know that if you're trying to plan, long-term operations, maintenance, renewal activities, setting out contracts to the businesses who help them support that, it's hard enough doing it with a 5-year sight of your funding and putting out those contracts in an effective and efficient way. And, the prospect of that going back to a 3-year or even worse, a 1-year spending review cycle, I think would probably be detrimental. So, it feels awkward, and there are plenty of hooks in there about reopeners and things which may render the whole conversation pointless anyway. But in future, but there is advantage in having that 5-year sight. And yeah, we haven't got it of everything, but at least we'd have it of part of it, and that is surely better than trying to align everything around a much shorter time frame.
Yes, I think the ideal would be to have a 5-year settlement for all of GBR. Perhaps that's unrealistic to look for in the current environment when the railways are still recovering from the loss of revenues following COVID. And you've clearly got the Treasury wanting to see a reduction in the operating subsidy going into the railways. Bernard.
All I'd say on that, Steve, is, and I never thought I'd see it, government has just committed to 3-year revenue funding for bus across the country. So we used to work together at Transport for London, then we, Steve, and Stephen was on the board of Transport for London. And back in the day, we were used to having both capital and revenue funding allocations, weren't we?
Yeah.
And then that all sort of went by the wayside, and London's financed in a completely different way now. But I am seeing. So thinking about the buses, I never thought I'd see that again. A 3-year commitment to a certain degree of revenue funding for, but which enables you to just plan in a completely different way and run your business far more efficiently. And we need to see a similar level of transparency, I think, and greater transparency actually, because if I'm in I sometimes cannot determine which bit of renewals and enhancements money has been allocated to North Wales relative to the northwest of the country. You can't tell because it's in a big block. And we've got to have more transparency, I think, over things like that.
Try working out how much has been spent on freight, Vernon, you'll win.
Yeah, Vernon, you're referring to that 10-year settlement, actually, which was amazing, that TfL got starting in about 2005, and it made an enormous difference to the efficiency with which the enterprise could be planned. Very unusual. I mean, I think that there are two weaknesses with the bill as drafted in relation to this 5-year planning cycle, the periodic review. I did say I welcomed it. It is still there. That's great. But the two weaknesses are that now, in what's proposed, first of all, the ORR is only advisory on whether or not what the government is proposing and what the money it's making available actually match up or not. In the past, in the current system, the ORR has to give it a tick, have to approve it and say that they do match up before it goes ahead. So I think in principle now, under the new legislation, the Secretary of State will be able to go ahead whether or not the ORR says they match up. The other thing, as I mentioned, is that it's not statutory. And we all know about events causing governments to have to change things. It was a really important feature of the current system that when things got difficult, the government had to honour, more or less, the settlement on the rail side. And it's worth, by the way, looking at what's going on the road side. I think what the government is now proposing for the railway is really quite similar to the long existing monitoring arrangement the ORR has with the road side, where again there is an HLOS and SOBA sort of process, but it's not statutory. Actually, on the whole, it has survived intact. In other words, government has not changed its mind every few months about the funding for the strategic roads, although in principle it could have done, and it did look at it from time to time, but it has, I think, honoured those 5-year periods. Let's hope in the new system they still do honour the 5-year process, because, by the way, when they don't, things go badly wrong. There was a period when in the periodic review that I was involved with, I came into it late, where things went badly on the railway because government, amongst other things, because government came in during the process and started changing things and asking Network Rail to do things that weren't in the plan and not providing the money for it. And then everybody lost the incentive to deliver the plan, and it all began to fall over in a rather unfortunate way. So in short, those long-term plans, and keeping to them is really important.
There's a question in the chat about incentivization of improvements. be they improvements to capacity, operational performance, passenger freight experience. Does the CapEx and OpEx split make this harder? So clearly within government accounting, it's very important to distinguish between capital and operating. Any views on that?
Steve, you're the finance guy. You should you should address that question. The short answer is yes. I mean, if you're running a business with a clear financial, whether it's a for profit or break even, whatever it is, then you'll have a clear idea about where you want to spend on capital and substitute revenue and vice versa. You want a free hand in running the business, and those artificial public sector constraints are a real pain. I would guess, but as I say, you're the expert. What's your view?
I think it does make it harder. I mean, as I say, I think over time, hopefully, can move to a longer term integrated plan. I mean, I think you'll still have to account for capital and operating expenditure separately, but at least there should be ability to make those trade-offs within the organisation and not be constrained by the route that the money flows through.
I think the Treasury has been a bit more flexible about allowing across-year flexibility and that kind of thing, hasn't it, in the past? I don't know how this will play out with a new bill.
Yes. Vernon.
I suppose one of the answers to that challenge is it depends on what the objectives are of the Treasury and the role in the railways. To come back to my earlier point, the railway isn't a thing in itself. It's there to help enable the delivery of benefits in all sorts of other avenues of the economy and other social outcomes. And until relatively recently, the so-called Green Book, against which you'd evaluate schemes and all the rest of it, precluded those wider benefits and made it much, much harder to actually justify investment. And I think that there's been a bit of loosening of that. But if you only measure the railway on railway type outputs, then we're not going to get very far to get the economy outside London and the South East firing on all cylinders. We've got to look at what it delivers in GVA locally, how much it starts to reduce the productivity gap, whether it helps deliver better health outcomes. And these things are fearsomely difficult to measure, actually. The reason why the other things are measured is because they're easy. And we've got to invest a bit more time in measuring the outcomes that are harder. But I can do it now, of course. In Manchester on bus, where we've seen phenomenal growth in bus because of investment in local services. And we know what those people are doing. There's always this danger of just narrowly measuring everything through the P&L of the railway industry. Someone in the chat has just put their finger right on it. Michael Whittaker has just said, in Wales, there's the Wellbeing the Future Generations Act, which enshrines a broader set of outcomes in Wales to be delivered through all of these things and not just through that narrower lens.
I think you're absolutely right, Vernon. And for us in freight, I think a lot of people think that we run freight trains on the network just to be annoying. I spend my life saying, no, it's because it's delivering for a supermarket, or it's delivering, for new homes and schools, or it's delivering fuel to power stations for 8 million homes, or whatever else it is. And in ways, freight, it's quite easy to see what that economic purpose is because we know who the customers are. We know, what they're doing, who their customers are. Down that, but it is really hard to get that sense of purpose driven through the railways. Another phrase that drives me mad when we talk about the whole industry finances, and I'm like, but we're not talking about the whole industry. We're talking about Network Rail and the passenger talk here. That isn't the whole industry, because the whole industry includes the rail terminal for Tesco's, for example, or their store that's reliant on that delivery. And we can never get that data into a model, but the whole industry is vastly bigger than people give it credit for if you start to look out into those purposes and those needs. And that, we talked about culture a bit, and that is really, really essential. I mean, if you just took, the classic dilemma of when do you do engineering work, you could take as much engineering work as you want if you're GBR, and you can stop the trains whenever you want to stop the trains and start the trains whenever, because they're your trains. You can do that. But how do we get that thinking about the productivity of freight, or about different patterns of travel in mayoral combined authorities compared to the national picture or whatever? That's a cultural piece about those purposes. And I do think that's going to be quite hard. I really do.
Yes, Stephen.
Going back to your question about the incentives to develop the railway, to invest, I can't overemphasize the importance of this long-term plan which is drafted into the bill. If that's done properly, and I hope it will be, and I know there's been good work going on this, it will give the government, with a small g, governments of the future, a clear idea where they want the railway to go, what it wants it to do over the next 30, 60 years. And then it will force the government to have a debate, hopefully, about how much money it's willing to devote to that activity as against other things. That's another debate we don't have at the moment. It's just a number. The Treasury is always trying to reduce the amount of money going into the railway. Department of Transport is always trying to increase it. It's not a way to have a proper long-term plan about how to develop the railway, what to invest in. I'm sure the railway professionals will have very good views about what you could do if only you had the money. How technically, what like digital signalling, as an example. But if the government of the day has got a long-term plan about where it wants to go and how much it's willing to pay over the long term, then they will be the people taking the initiative on developing the railway, and of course then the rail professionals, GBR, will be in a position to deliver that.
Thank you. In the last few minutes, I just wanted to pick up on Maggie's point about culture. And obviously culture isn't something that can be written into legislation. But I'd be interested in the panelists' thoughts about there does seem to be a bit of an assumption you just put the organisations together and automatically they'll be integrated. How would you like to see, or what steps do you think the different parties should be taking between now and the establishment of GBR to start to build that change in culture?
But I mean, I think at the beginning there's going to have to be some, fairly soon, some open honesty about what the structure of the organisation is going to be. In the first instance, it's still, very, very opaque, and I know a lot of people are working really hard on that. But as the first basics, we need to see that, because that will sort of dictate some of the tensions. The frameworks in the bill are helpful, but how does a duty to freight in my world and other things manifest itself out through that organisation and into the toolbox talks or the performance bonuses or the objectives of those people who work there, and how is that going to play out? Because it is going to be a very different culture to where people have been from, and we're going to need to support them in making that change.
Thank you. Vernon.
I think the spending some time out of London would be good. And coming out with some local discussions and walking the course. And to be fair, I'm starting to see that more. I hope we don't just get consumed now for the next several years about deck chair movement, if I may put it that way, because we haven't got time to do any of that. We need to get on with things. I think the key thing is that the rhetoric from the senior people has to filter its way right the way down the organisation to the day-to-day decision making. And that is a massive cultural challenge, I think, for the whole railways industry. It's almost like reversing the sort of spin of the earth on its axis, actually, because everything has been so centralised in the past. We've got to get ourselves into a position where, because when you talk to anybody senior in the industry, they say all of the right things. And I'm increasingly seeing the behaviours match what they say. But it's when you get to the second, third, fourth levels down, and you're trying to get something done somewhere, and you run into the same old sand. And so there needs to be real focus on ways of working, as much as making sure that we have the right things enshrined on the face of the bill.
Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, I'd agree. Over the centuries, we've had all sorts of different arrangements for the railways. I think that history shows you if you have the right people at the top, any structure can be made to work. And if you don't have the right people at the top, it won't. So the question is also how do you get the right people at the top? And as Maggie's indicating, at the moment, there's not enough clarity, I wouldn't have thought, to attract the right distinguished people to do the right thing at the top of the industry. So that's really important for me. Creating something that really good people will want to get involved with and be willing to run. It's not just about pay, of course. It's about the right kind of senior public servant.
That's great. And sorry, I'm going to have to draw the discussion to a close there. It's been really wide-ranging and interesting, and I think we could have carried on for quite a lot longer, but everybody's time is constrained. So I'd like to thank Maggie, Vernon, and Stephen for their contributions. It's been really interesting and useful. I'm not going to try and summarize what was a very wide-ranging, but I think there were some key points around welcoming having a centralized or an integrated party to deal with, but some areas that people would like to see strengthening of the plans and the relationships. So a quick reminder, we will send out a replay of this webinar, and if you have any questions, then please send them to communications@cpcs.ca. And thank you everybody for joining today's discussion.